Hi everybody. Yeah, a nighttime video. I'm taking an evening walk. I spent the day working on my dissertation. Karen and I took a very long walk last night. Well, very. Everything's relative. I think we walked almost 11 kilometers, so that's going to get added to the total. Times 2 because we both did it, and both our kilometers are kilometered. Well, we have this whole debate about the word mileage and can we say kilometerage. Anyway, they both count. So I'll be adding that to the total, and I'm gonna aim for another close to 10 kilometers this evening. I'm stoked to announce that we reached our $3,000 goal today after my plea on Facebook saying we're only like $103 away. Come on, people. Somebody generously donated the total amount that was remaining. So obviously people can still go donate. The more the better, because it's great for the shelter and the project that they're working on to help families who have to deal with the racist Department of Youth Protection, and so that's great. So so that means you know, I mean, by Friday I should be able to walk the number of kilometers that I pledged, which is 125 total. I'm about 32 away from that now, so that's doable in 3 days. She actually, I think, already walked the number of kilometers that she pledged to, but she's very insistent on walking, which, you know, it's something we do anyway. So the day before yesterday, in my daily video, I talked about systemic racism and gave you some homework to go look at the Commission Vient report to help understand how systemic racism is present in the institutions. And I said that the next day I'd do kind of something similar for the concept of genocide, but then I wound up talking about Resilience Montreal. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about the concept of genocide. And I mean, a lot of it is, you know, it's stuff that I've said in these, you know, the preceding videos, but I'll try to kind of bring it all together in line with that concept. And well, I mean, not completely, because, you know, I'm trying to keep these under 15 minutes, and it would take a lot longer than that to really go into depth. But again, just to give you kind of avenues of thought, again, especially these videos are kind of aimed at folks who are new to the topic. So if you already know this stuff, you probably don't need to be listening to this, and which is very likely the case if you're Indigenous yourself, or if you're someone who's just taking the time to inform yourself. So the reason I thought it was really relevant, well, it's always relevant to talk about this, but as I quickly mentioned the other day, or maybe yesterday, or I don't remember when, I think it was it in 2018? Yeah, 2018, a report came out based on the inquiry for the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Some folks include Two-Spirits in that as well. And, you know, people had been pushing for the government to do an inquiry on this for a long time. When Stephen Harper was still Prime Minister, he just kept saying no to this because he was like, this is not a... He wasn't necessarily denying that Indigenous women and girls were, you know, going missing and getting murdered, but he was doing a bit like Legault is doing with the denial of systemic racism. You know, he was kind of denying that it had anything to do with any, you know, social phenomenon. I mean, this is the same guy who in some speech at some point said, oh, there was never any colonialism in Canada. Like, which, fuck off, dude. Anyway, so he said, you know, no and no. And then, you know, the Liberals came in, and, you know, I'm not a big fan of any of these parties or the whole colonial system, as those of you who've talked with me for more than 5 minutes know. But I don't remember if they said, okay, we're going to do this. I know that in their campaign, election campaign, they were really working on getting the Indigenous vote and were making a lot of promises. So I don't remember if this was one of them or if they kind of responded to pressure on this. But there was an inquiry. And so, and there was a report based on this. And in their report, and there are many recommendations that come out of that, again, with regards to all the different systems in our society, and and they used the word genocide, not cultural genocide, which is what happened with the Truth and Reconciliation report back in 2015, which for a lot of people softens the blow a little bit. But they said, no, this phenomenon of high rates of Indigenous women and girls who are going missing and getting murdered is a product of genocide against Indigenous peoples. So of course there were very strong reactions to that. People don't like, a lot of people don't like applying that term. And it's unfortunate because a lot of people, oh, by the way, a side note, Murray, I just said that in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, they use the term cultural genocide. But I wanted to note, though, that Murray Sinclair, who chaired that commission, and if you don't know who Murray Sinclair is, you absolutely have to go look him up. He has said publicly that he wouldn't hesitate to just use the term genocide to refer to all of this. So I don't know if what happened behind the scenes and why they decided to go with cultural genocide, if it was kind of, a strategy knowing that people would just refuse to read it otherwise. But the people who wrote the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women used the term genocide. And so a lot of people, particularly non-Indigenous people, resist using that term in application to what's been going on in colonial Canada. And I think, I didn't come up with this, but probably a lot of people resist because they associate the term genocide with things like the Holocaust, or what happened in Rwanda, the Armenian genocide, where there's actual overt attempts to physically eliminate a people. So people think of death camps, they think of people, being killed in large, massive numbers, often in a short period of time, relatively short, because a few years is short, in the grand scheme of things. But it's been pointed out by many Indigenous scholars and activists and educators and others that if you look at the definition of genocide, it includes processes that wind up leading to not necessarily death, but the kind of extinction of a people in terms of their identity. Okay, so people have argued that the term does apply for two main reasons. First of all, there have been instances of specific nations pretty much being wiped out in different situations. So sometimes it was through disease early on with European quote-unquote exploration, and some would argue that this wasn't intentional, and at first it wasn't, because people weren't necessarily aware of what was going on at the time. But with Europeans coming and being carriers of diseases to which they were immune because of generations of exposure, but then they were still carrying them, a lot like what's going on right now, right? You can be asymptomatic but still carry the COVID virus and give it to other people. So that happened because the indigenous folks here hadn't been exposed to these diseases. So a lot of people got wiped out. But there is, convincing evidence that once certain Europeans saw this was happening, that there were some instances of intentionally trying to wipe groups of people out. And in different parts of the so-called New World, there were different degrees of physical violence. And, sometimes in relocations, if you hear about the Trail of Tears, with people being physically relocated on these very long marches, a lot of people wound up dying. And displacing, just the act of displacing people from their traditional homelands, where they know how to survive, they know the terrain, they know the climate, they know the movements of the animals, they know when the plants grow and where. And relocating people to a location, you don't always have to go far. You can just be a few kilometers away, and maybe things are quite different, and then people have to readapt. And also colonial interference with the theft of lands often would wind up to changes in migration patterns of animals. More recent instances, you also have things like waters getting diverted because of damming, or just really environmental changes that have a direct impact on the physical well-being of indigenous people. And then of course there's all the discrimination that's been happening through the Indian Act and residential schools and the 60s scoop and the intergenerational effects of that, like survivors of all these things suffering from trauma that sometimes, not always, but sometimes leads them to, not have the abilities to parent, or to turn to different kinds of intoxication to relieve the shame and the pain. So, that winds up getting transmitted through the generations in terms of, trauma being passed down and learned and inherited. And, so in that sense, the physical well-being of indigenous people has very much been affected. And that ties into missing and murdered women, because when you have high rates of, say, domestic violence, this is one example, right, that's very common. If you have high rates of domestic violence with, men taking their strong emotions out on their partners and their children, in the case of heterosexual relations, men taking it out on their wives or girlfriends, or just girls growing up, well, all kids, but here we're talking about girls and women in particular, growing up in that kind of environment where maybe they're dealing with physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, toxic parents, and wanting to run away, sometimes at young ages, to cities where they're vulnerable to predators, all kinds of predators, and sometimes getting trafficked, being brought into the sex trade against their will. Now, just a note here, just so that people know, I am pro-sex workers' rights, so this is not a knock on sex work or sex workers, but like anything else, if they're brought into it against their will, then that's the problem. So trafficking and or non-consensual sex work. So or they're often some of these young girls or women get kidnapped, raped, killed, and there are so many examples of this in the media. So in terms of that physical effect of people losing their lives, either through murder, either because of poverty, all this links back to colonialism, and it does become the case that colonialism is the cause of widespread death and in some cases, you know, entire populations have come close to being wiped out. So, yeah, you know, people, and the other thing is that, you know, this has been taking place, it continues to take place over a very long period of time. And a lot of people, again, because of what we learn in schools, tend to think of genocide, again, as something that happens in a condensed period of time, this overt project to exterminate a population. But this has been going on for centuries, and it's like this kind of long, slow process in the grand scheme of things. So I think that's why it's less visible to a lot of people as something that can qualify as genocide. So we're already at almost 16 minutes, so I'm gonna shut up very soon. Your homework, and again, it's not like you have to hand in homework, it's just suggestions for people who want to know more. So even if you haven't started the homework I gave you last time, you can put this on your list and go look at the report. So you can just Google missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry, and it'll, you know, come up with a link that you can look at. These reports tend to be very long, but you can at least start by maybe looking at the recommendations and then picking out the sections that are you know, that you feel most passionately about. And of course I'll include the link in today's bulletin. So that's it for today. It's a bit of a grim talk, but it's really important, and more people need to be aware of this so that we can all push for it to stop. And that's it for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow.